The oil man had not stopped laughing for a full 30 seconds. He stood at the back of the auction tent just outside Hagerman, New Mexico, on a cold, bright November morning in 1985, his pressed Wranglers still holding the crease from the iron, his new felt Stetson clean of any dust a working ranch might have put on it. His name was Roy Chesterton. He had come out from Midland, Texas, with 3 other men from Pecos Basin Energy and a brick-sized cellular telephone. He liked to hold the way a preacher holds a Bible. He was looking at a man standing quietly in the back aisle of the tent, the way certain people look at a stray dog that has wandered into a hotel lobby. The man they were looking at wore a dark wool coat with 2 mismatched patches on the left elbow. His Carhartts had dried caliche mud on the cuffs. His Red Wings had been resoled twice. He held a stained work cap in both hands the way a man holds a hat in church. He did not smile. He did not look up at the men who were laughing. His face was calm in the way a man looks when he has already decided something inside himself but has not yet told anyone. Let me tell you about that man. His name was Silas Halverson. He was 48 years old that November. He ran 640 acres of hard grass country 2 hours east of Roswell, on land his grandfather had homesteaded in 1922. He had been mocked, at one point or another, by nearly every man sitting in the folding chairs in front of him. And he was about to do something at that auction that not one of them saw coming. But to understand what happened that morning, how a quiet rancher in a patched coat outbid 4 Texas oilmen for the worst piece of land in Chavez County, you have to go back to an August afternoon in 1962, when a 5-year-old boy walked along a dry arroyo with his father and put his small hand on the ground and felt something cool where the rest of the world was burning. The Halverson Ranch sat on the eastern edge of the Pecos River Basin, high desert country, thin soil over caliche, grama grass, and mesquite, and long views. Anders Halverson, Silas's father, had inherited the place from his father Niels, who came down from a Minnesota farm in 1922 with a wife, a wagon, and the particular Scandinavian stubbornness that mistakes hardship for a form of prayer. By the summer of 1962, the country was in the 3rd year of a drought so severe the state cattle inspector had begun using the word emergency. The grass had gone the color of old paper. The stock tanks were low. Anders took Silas out one afternoon that August, not for any particular reason. Just walking, which was the thing Anders did when he needed to think without having to explain himself. They walked from the barn out toward the northwest corner of the ranch, along a dry arroyo that cut down through the caliche. It was hot. The sky was that hard pale blue that stops feeling like weather and starts feeling like a condition. About half a mile out, Anders stopped. He knelt on one knee. He pointed at a patch of ground maybe 15 feet across where a small stand of blue grama was still green. Everywhere else the grass was dead. Here, it was alive. Anders took Silas's small hand and pressed it flat against the ground. The ground was cool. Not cold. Cool. Everywhere else the earth was hot enough to burn through a boot sole. Here it was cool. Now here is what you need to understand. Anders Halverson was not a man who explained things twice. He said quietly that his own grandfather, Silas's great-grandfather, back in Minnesota, had told him about a thing that happened on high desert ranches. That underneath certain arroyos there ran what the old Norwegian farmers called an underground river. That in dry years the cattle who knew about it would drift toward those spots, because the ground stayed cool, because the grass stayed green, because the water was there below them, even when there was no water anywhere above. He said his own father had shown him this spot when he was about Silas's age. He said the water ran diagonally from the north end of the ranch down through the northwest corner, and then off Halverson land altogether. He said nobody had ever put that on a map. It lived in the family, in the walking, in the ground, under your hand, and that was all he said. Silas was 5 years old. He did not fully understand, but he remembered the cool ground. He remembered the green grass in the middle of a dead country. He remembered his father's hand pressing his own against the earth. 2 years later, in the winter of 1964, Anders Halverson was killed when a pickup truck rolled on him while he was working alone fixing a broken fence in the north pasture on a hard, freezing February morning. He was 39. Silas was 7. His younger brother Peter was 3. Their mother, Ingrid, was 38 years old and had never once considered any life that was not this one. Ingrid Halverson did not remarry. She did not sell an acre. She did not complain. She took bookkeeping work at the feed cooperative in Roswell 3 days a week. She ran the ranch the other 4. She rose before the sun and finished after dark, and moved through the property the way water moves through stone. Not dramatically, but with a persistence that eventually changes the shape of things. She was, in the language of that country, a hard woman. Which is to say, she was a woman who had already grieved everything a woman can grieve, and was now simply working. Silas grew up watching her. He was old enough to understand what she was carrying, and not old enough to help her carry it. That helplessness, the specific ache of watching someone bear a weight you cannot yet lift, settled into his chest and stayed there. It became, over the years, not a wound. It became an engine. But he remembered the cool ground under his hand. A note for the listener. In the high desert country of eastern New Mexico, shallow aquifers along ancient arroyo systems were, and still are, one of the least mapped hydrologic resources in the American West. State geological surveys through the mid-20th century concentrated on the major artesian basins near Roswell and Artesia. Smaller diagonal spring lines running under private ranch land were often known only to the ranchers who worked the ground, passed down by walking and observation rather than by any formal record. In dry years, those unmapped waters were the difference between a ranch that survived and a ranch that did not. Part 2. In the spring of 1972, when Silas was 15 years old, a foreman from a Midland outfit called Pecos Basin Energy drove up the long dirt road to the Halverson Ranch in a white company pickup and knocked on the kitchen door of the farmhouse. Ingrid answered. The foreman was a heavy-set man in a straw hat with a company folder under his arm. He had a straightforward proposition. Pecos Basin had leased mineral rights on a section of the neighboring McRae land, 2,400 acres directly west of the Halverson property, and was in the process of drilling 3 shallow test wells for oil. The drilling required water, a great deal of water. More water than the McRae stock tanks could supply. The foreman had noticed on the county map that the far northwest corner of the Halverson Ranch held a small stock tank fed by what he assumed was a modest hand-dug well of no significance. He proposed that Pecos Basin run a temporary pipeline across that corner and draw from the tank for the duration of the drilling program. In exchange, the company would pay the Halversons $60 a month, cash delivered on the first of every month. Ingrid Halverson considered this. $60 a month in 1972 was the difference between the property taxes being paid on time and being paid late. It was the difference between the boys having new boots for winter and going without. She said yes. She did not read the lease carefully because the lease was short and the amount was small, and she had 4 hours of bookkeeping to finish before supper. Silas was in the barn that afternoon when the foreman drove away. He came into the kitchen and his mother told him about the arrangement in 3 sentences. The way she told him everything, without embellishment or apology. Silas listened. He nodded. He walked back out to the barn. He climbed up to the hayloft where he kept a coffee can with a rubber band around it. Inside the coffee can was a folded piece of butcher paper. On the butcher paper was a rough map he had been drawing since he was 10 years old, of every place on the ranch where the grass stayed green in dry years, every place where the ground stayed cool under his hand, every place where the mesquite roots ran deeper than they had any business running. He unfolded the butcher paper on the loft floor. The northwest corner of the Halverson Ranch, the corner where the stock tank sat, the corner where Pecos Basin was about to run its pipeline, was the exact spot his father had shown him in August of 1962. He did not tell his mother. He did not tell his brother. He did not tell anyone. He folded the butcher paper. He put it back in the coffee can. He climbed down from the loft. And this is the part that matters. For the next 13 years, the Pecos Basin trucks came and went from the northwest corner of the Halverson Ranch. They pumped water for their drilling operations. Their test wells came up dry, one after another. But they kept the pipeline in place because it was cheap and reliable, and because $60 a month was a rounding error on a company balance sheet. They believed in the confident way company men believe things, that they were exploiting a naive widow and her strange, quiet son. They believed the stock tank was fed by a small well that would eventually run dry. Every year they were surprised that it did not. What they did not know, what Silas alone knew because his father had shown him, was that the tank sat directly on top of an unmapped spring line, an aquifer that ran diagonally beneath the ranch and off to the west, and that every gallon Pecos Basin was pulling out was being replenished from below by a source no state hydrologist had ever documented. Silas kept walking the ground, year after year. He walked it in every season. He carried his father's compass and a small notebook and a 50-foot length of measuring tape. He noted the exact points where the arroyo grass stayed greenest. He measured the depth of mesquite taproots by counting the tail of dirt on the roots. The county road crews pulled up when they cleared the culverts. He borrowed hydrology textbooks from the Roswell Public Library and read them in the evenings by a single lamp at the kitchen table after his mother and Peter had gone to bed. He taught himself the vocabulary of aquifers and recharge zones and confining layers. He was not a scholar. He was a rancher who had decided that the examination was the work. By the time he was 22, he had transferred the butcher paper map onto a proper piece of graph paper, and the map told him something that stopped him cold. The spring line did not stay under the Halverson Ranch. It ran diagonally southwest, off Halverson land after about a quarter of a mile, and continued for another 3 miles under the neighboring McRae property. Not the whole McRae Ranch, a specific section along the eastern edge. 900 acres of thin caliche pasture that the McRae family had never grazed heavily, because the surface soil looked worthless, because the grass never came in thick, because nobody had ever seen a reason to develop it. Silas walked that section of the McRae land twice, quietly, when the McRae hands were working the West Range. He put his hand on the ground in 3 places. The ground was cool. He told no one what he had found. Not his mother, not his brother, not Frank McRae, whose land it was. He folded the graph paper and put it in a metal box under the floorboard of his bedroom, and he went back to working cattle. A note for the listener. Between 1968 and 1982, the oil and gas exploration industry in the Permian Basin drilled thousands of shallow test wells across southeastern New Mexico and West Texas. Most came up dry. Those exploration leases required enormous quantities of fresh water for drilling mud, and water access agreements with adjoining ranchers were often signed for very small monthly sums, sometimes as little as $50 or $60. Many of those agreements ran for a decade or more before either side reconsidered the actual value of what was changing hands. Part 3. In the fall of 1979, the cattle market collapsed. Beef prices dropped by more than a third in 8 months. Ranches across the American Southwest went under in numbers not seen since the Dust Bowl. The Halverson operation survived, but only barely. Silas was 22. He had taken over the day-to-day running of the ranch 3 years earlier, when his mother's back finally gave out from 30 years of the work she had refused to stop doing. Peter, his younger brother, had left for the Navy at 18 and had not come back. Silas paid the mortgage that year by selling every calf on the property, including breeding stock he had wanted to keep. He and his mother lived through that winter on beans and pinto flour and the last of the previous summer's canned tomatoes. They did not lose the ranch. That was the year Silas learned that surviving something is not the same as winning it. Surviving is just the price of admission to the next round. In the spring of 1981, old Frank McRae stopped Silas outside the feed store in Roswell and mentioned in the offhand way ranchers mention important things that the family had been talking about maybe selling the eastern section of their place. 900 acres. The thin caliche section along the boundary with the Halverson Ranch. Frank was tired. His sons were not going to stay in ranching. He wanted to reduce the operation before the market decided for him. Silas said very little in response. He nodded. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked to his truck. That afternoon, he drove to the First Southwestern Agricultural Bank in Roswell. He walked into the loan office wearing his patched coat and his working boots, and he sat across a desk from a man named Del Rutherford. And he told Del Rutherford that he wanted to borrow $42,000 to buy the eastern section of the McRae property. Del Rutherford looked at Silas's patched coat. He looked at his overdue tractor payment. He looked at the parcel Silas was proposing to buy, which every rancher in Chaves County knew was the worst grazing land in the district. He asked Silas why he wanted it. Silas said quietly that he had his reasons. Del Rutherford turned him down that afternoon, not later. That afternoon, across the desk, Silas drove home. He did not tell his mother. He drove to Artesia the next week and asked the rural cooperative for the same loan. They turned him down inside of an hour. He drove home again. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the cold spring air without a jacket and stayed there until the cold worked through his shirt. He was not angry in the hot reactive way. He was feeling the weight of the no, the way you feel cold. not as something that changes the underlying facts, but as something you have to sit with until you decide what to do next. The next morning, he went into town and applied for a beginning farmer loan through a small federal program run by the United States Department of Agriculture, which he had read about in an agricultural bulletin the previous year. The application ran 28 pages. He filled it out at the kitchen table across 3 evenings. He submitted it in April of 1981. He heard nothing for 6 months. In October, they approved him for $28,000, not enough to buy the McRae section outright, but enough to open a real conversation with a small livestock investor named Wendell Rook out of Amarillo, whom Silas had met at a cattle auction the previous fall. Wendell Rook was a quiet man himself. He listened to what Silas told him about the eastern section of the McRae Ranch. He did not ask what Silas knew. He asked whether Silas would let him drive the section. Silas drove him out one afternoon in December. Wendell got out of the truck. He looked at the caliche. He looked at Silas. He said, "I don't need to know what you know. If you want to buy it, I'll come in with you on the difference." That was the whole conversation. The paperwork was drawn up over the winter of 1982. The McRae family agreed to a private sale contingent on financing, but before the closing could happen, in the summer of 1983, a range fire came through the eastern half of the Halverson Ranch and burned a third of the calf crop. Silas nearly lost everything. He sold his father's 1958 Ford pickup, the one Anders had been driving the year before he died, to make the fall mortgage payment. He wrote a 2-line letter to Wendell Rook asking to postpone the McRae purchase. Wendell wrote back one sentence, "I will wait." And in the same summer, something else happened. A man named Roy Chesterton, an oil and gas investor out of Midland who had spent 3 years mocking Silas at the feed store, who had once, in front of half the county, imitated the way Silas walked with his head down, drove up the Halverson Ranch Road unannounced one afternoon in June. His own operation had been hit by the drought. His cattle, which he ran on the west side of Chavez County as a hobby, were losing weight fast. He needed a temporary lease for grazing on Silas's south pasture for 6 weeks. He came up to the fence with his eyes directed at the middle distance, and he asked, without apologizing for anything that had preceded the request. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, $1 a head, and left the gate open behind him as he walked back to the barn. He did not mention the years of mockery. He did not need to. In the fall of 1984, old Frank McRae died. His family filed to foreclose on the ranch to settle the estate. The auction was set for November of 1985, on a cold, bright blue morning, in a canvas tent, pitched on the McRae home place just outside Hagerman. And Silas Halverson prepared, quietly, without telling anyone in Chavez County what he was preparing for, to buy the exact 900 acres he had walked and studied and mapped for 23 years. A note for the listener. The United States Department of Agriculture Beginning Farmer Loan Program, expanded significantly in the late 1970s, was designed to provide credit access to rural producers who did not qualify under conventional commercial banking criteria. In practice, the program served and continues to serve ranchers and farmers whose collateral was land the local banks had already dismissed. Many of the most successful mid-scale ranching operations across the American Southwest in the 1980s and 90s trace their initial capital to that single federal program. Local commercial banks, by their own criteria, had turned those same operators away. Part 4. Now we come back to the tent. That cold, bright November morning in 1985. The canvas walls glowing softly with the desert light. The folding chairs filled with bitters. Roy Chesterton and his 3 men from Pecos Basin Energy in the second row. All of them turned in their chairs to look back at the quiet man standing in the back aisle, in a patched wool coat with a work cap held in both hands. The auctioneer was calling the bids. The McRae Ranch had been divided into 3 parcels. The first 2, the West Range and the home place. The Midland group bid on aggressively, and won. The Pecos Basin men laughed and clapped each other on the shoulder. Roy Chesterton turned and shook his head at Silas with an amused half-smile, as if to say, "This is not your day, brother." Then the third parcel came up. The eastern 900 acres. The thin caliche pasture. The section every rancher in Chavez County had already dismissed. The auctioneer opened at $15 an acre, low even for that land. Silas raised his paddle. Roy Chesterton laughed out loud. He raised his own at 20. Silas raised at 25. Roy raised at 30. Silas at 35. It went on for 4 minutes. Roy stopped at 58 because his own men were tugging at his sleeve, telling him he was overpaying just to prove a point. Silas bid 60. Nobody countered. The auctioneer looked around the tent twice. Then he brought down the hammer. Silas Halverson had bought the worst 900 acres in Chavez County for $54,000. The Midland men laughed on their way out of the tent. Roy Chesterton clapped him on the shoulder as he passed and said, "Enjoy your caliche, cowboy." Silas said nothing. Over the next 18 months, Silas drilled 2 wells. The first at the exact point on his graph paper map where his father had put his small hand on the ground in 1962. The well came in at 14 gallons a minute. The second, drilled 200 yards southwest, came in at 22. Sweetwater, sustained flow. A hydrologist from New Mexico State University drove out to certify the wells and told Silas he was sitting on an unrecorded northern lobe of the Roswell Artesian System. By the summer of 1986, Silas had filed water rights on both wells under New Mexico State Code, backdating the priority date, correctly and legally, to a hand-dug survey his father had kept in 1959. He signed an exclusive water supply agreement with a new agricultural cooperative moving into the eastern county, $315 an acre-foot, on a 20-year contract. And in September of 1987, Grant Whitmore, the operations manager for Pecos Basin Energy, arrived at the gate of the Halverson Ranch to renew the water lease. A legal letter was folded into thirds in his breast pocket. He was smiling in the confident way of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to end. He proposed to renew the lease at $60 a month. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he opened the gate and told him to follow. He walked Whitmore out to the northwest corner. He showed him the monitoring wells, the flow rate log he had kept in his own handwriting for 25 years, the state water rights filing on file in Santa Fe, the signed 20-year exclusive supply agreement with the cooperative, the map his father had shown him in 1962, redrawn on real geological paper, showing the aquifer running under both his land and the section he had just bought at auction. Grant Whitmore stopped smiling. He stood in the northwest corner of the Halverson Ranch for a long time without speaking. Then he made 2 phone calls he had not planned to make. And by the end of the afternoon, he had signed a new water access agreement for a rate roughly 200 times what his company had been paying for 13 years. He did not laugh again. He never said Silas Halverson's name in a company meeting without a careful pause before he said it. There is a version of this story that is about the money. The wells, the cooperative contracts, the second parcel 3 years later, the roof his mother finally let him replace on the farmhouse. Those things are real. They are documented. They are not the story. The story is about what Silas Halverson felt when he was 5 years old and his father put his small hand on the ground, and it was cool. About the distance between what something is and what it can become. A gap invisible to people moving too fast, that becomes legible only to those willing to stay still long enough for their eyes to adjust. Most of what the world considers worthless is not worthless. It is ground that arrives at the wrong moment for the wrong observer, and was never walked long enough to be understood. Silas Halverson walked it. He walked it for 25 years, with the patience of a man who had decided early that the walking was the work. The last light of a November afternoon in 1987 was going long across the caliche. Silas stood at the arroyo in the northwest corner of what was now his own land. His mother Ingrid, 71, walked out from the farmhouse and stood beside him. She did not say anything. She had never used language when something else would serve. She looked at the ground. She looked at her son. Then she reached out and touched his sleeve just once, at the place where the second patch had been sown. Silas knelt down. He took off his glove. He pressed his hand flat against the ground the way his father had pressed his small hand there in August of 1962. The ground was cool. Somewhere below it, the water was moving the way it had been moving for 100,000 years. Indifferent to the tent full of laughing oilmen. Indifferent to the 2 banks that had told him no. Indifferent to the fire and the market collapse and the sold pickup and the 13 years of $60 a month. It had been there the whole time. He stood back up. He put on his glove. And he walked with his mother back toward the farmhouse where the kitchen light was on, and tomorrow's work was already waiting. A note for the listener. Water rights in the American West, and particularly in New Mexico under the state's prior appropriation doctrine, operate on a first-in-time, first-in-right basis. The priority date of a well is the single most valuable attribute a water right can hold. A properly filed early priority date, backed by documented historical use, can be worth more than the land above it. In arid ranching country, the ground is not what the sky looks at.